the kind introduction. And yeah, just want to pay my acknowledgements to the Earth Commons and Funding the Commons team. Thank you for the invitation. I know it's late in the day. It's been an awesome event. I really enjoyed it. My name is Matthew Monahan. I'm going to share a bit about what we're thinking around funding for regenerative land projects. A bit through the lens of my story, as Tony mentioned briefly. So I grew up in the Midwest in Southern Illinois. I was lucky to have parents who instilled in my brother and I love for the outdoors, kept us outside, whether that was on the baseball field or in the forest or on the lakes and so forth. We went to Silicon Valley, ended up here in the Bay Area in California for the better part of 12 years, chasing the startup dream and the entrepreneurial dream. And early on in the journey, I think, really became moved and troubled by the ecological and climate crisis. I know this framework has been useful to many of us in the room, Planetary Boundaries at the Stockholm Resilience Center. And for me, it really gave me a lens early in my journey to, wow, this is so much bigger than global warming or carbon dioxide. The context of our time, we're seeing the life support systems, the deterioration of our biosphere, and it's happening on our watch at just a staggering speed and scale. And now we are also learning more about all of these converging exponential tipping points. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, and for us, we decided that we really wanted to get alongside people who have their hands in the soil and were doing things around land use transition. So we were fortunate enough to sell the company, which was around public records, data management here called Reflection in Silicon Valley, and we just took a hard pivot and we moved to a farm outside of Wellington in New Zealand. Migrated with the whole family, brother, sister-in-law, mother, sister-in-law's brother, sister, just a whole gaggle of us. And we landed on a farm that's very much a prototypical New Zealand farm. It was a monoculture pine plantation. So you're talking 1,000 acres of one species of tree planted all at the same time for commercial logging and commodity forestry and dairy that was at the point when we got there, it was a bankrupt farm with a lot of derelict infrastructure, heavy fertilizer use. And this is the challenge that New Zealand faces with a lot of land use transition is what are the pathways to regenerative agriculture and reforestation? And these patterns rhyme, of course, with so much of the land use transition that we face globally. So fast forward, basically 10 years. This has been, hugely rewarding, hugely humbling work. We now have, market gardens with wash and pack infrastructure, a glass house, and a cute little farm shop that, the local community comes and picks up their vegetables and eggs and meat products. We stopped the dairy, moved into kind of the regenerative ag playbook around cows and sheep, systematically taking paddocks and gullies and steep areas out of animal production and moving it back into forests and permanent reforestation. The river that runs through the farm, Mungaroa River, is where we get our namesake, and we really see that as the lifeblood of the community. And so that's meant a lot of planting trees along the riparian pathways, something like 50,000 trees in the last few years, as well as walking corridors, because what we've come to realize is that a theory of change, that if we can bring community pride and love for the waterways, that's sort of a gateway to a lot of these broader conversations, ecological education. And we're now starting our journey around more operationalizing the tours and the educational workshops. So there's about 25 of us in the land. We're also kind of re-inhabiting the village and many things that means. And probably, most excited and heartwarmed by the fact that we now have not only more dogs than adults, but now more kids than dogs. So it's very much a multi-generational project. And land ownership, of course, is a very fraught topic and part of this transition. And the best answer that we could come up with is kind of stewarding this land inside of a charitable trust. So we took the proceeds also of the company's sale, and we moved that into what we call buy and trust. And Biome Trust is an operating nonprofit as well as a grant-making organization. And we essentially have tried to get alongside a lot of sister projects in Aotearoa and New Zealand, doing things like community gardens and school education, conservation, restoration, etc. And that's taught me a lot about this field of philanthropy. We've given out to hundreds of organizations, often kind of small-scale grants, totaling about $70 million now to date. Really a kind of a venture philanthropy approach of betting on great leaders, taking risks, being willing to be the first check into an organization, and just really trying to embrace the rapid velocity of experimentation and failure. And one of the key observations that I want to bring attention to from that work in the philanthropic space is this slide, which really tells two stories. The first is that we have globally trillions of dollars in this philanthropic ecosystem, well over $1 trillion in the United States. And those philanthropic assets are in endowments, and those endowments are invested mostly in traditional equity and bond portfolios, in the kind of economic patterns that are very much what we're trying to disrupt and change. And so, philanthropic capital is arguably some of the most liberated capital from debt incentives or growth incentives, and yet only roughly 5% per year is granted out into the nonprofit ecosystem to people raising funds. The 5% represents kind of the minimum mandated by law in some jurisdictions, although I would point out it's very easy to get around that legally. But that's kind of the averages according to most studies. Of that 5%, roughly 2 to 4% goes into environmental causes. And that's a pretty generous definition of what an environmental cause is. And this has been pretty flat for several years now, despite a lot of studies corroborating this in a lot of different geographies. So I just think that it's really important for us to keep pointing to this, because we're in the Earth's hottest years on record, and we have all of these challenges, and yet we're talking about 20 cents of every $100 actually getting on the ground into environmental work in philanthropy. And philanthropy is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a hemorrhaging patient. It's still only a small slice of the global economy. I haven't been able to shake my love of software and technology, and I've spent a lot of time, on the PathX planting trees, listening to crypto podcasts, and derived a lot of inspiration from people in this room. And so last year decided that, we would stop just consuming and start producing more content as well. Got on the road with a couple of the guys in this room who started to go to events like Eat Denver and Refi Summit and New York Climate Week, and just really getting the microphone out and talking to folks. And just want to also thank and acknowledge many folks in this room who've been on the Regeneration Will Be Funded show, exploring these different threads and webs of nuanced, long-form conversations to really try to follow our nose around philanthropy, Web3, carbon credits, commons, rights of nature, ecocide, and every time we peel back one layer, it leads to 5 more, and it's been super exciting work. And now we're really starting the next chapter, which is we're going to continue to do the media. We want to build out kind of just a lean, high-performance organizational team distributed around producing content and amplifying stories in this regenerative economy space. I think it's super important and exciting that we're all kind of learning out in the open and bringing along folks on this journey, and feeling quite compelled to keep working on the plumbing and the infrastructure to make sure that we're bringing capital into regenerative activities on the ground with communities in relationship with place. So we're throwing our hat in the ring on the next Gitcoin grants round, GG20, with a matching pool of $100,000 worth of ETH for place-based regenerative land projects. We're inviting a lot of the network that we have in New Zealand and people doing this work who are largely not connected to Web3 at all, as well as other land projects like Brave Earth in Costa Rica, some of you may know, kind of a living laboratory doing really interesting things. We've reached out to the Regen folks, and what Atosa and Gregory shared yesterday around the Jaguar Biocultural Credits Project, and we get that into the round. Sylvie with the amazing work that Jimo's doing. And most of you, I think, are familiar with this kind of quadratic funding model. It's just one implementation, of course, but I think it's really showing itself to find product market fit in this kind of community crowdfunding, crowdsourcing, and really trying to bring new network effects. And in speaking with other funders in the philanthropic ecosystem, I think there's a real open-mindedness and a curiosity of what's happening in these rooms and in these conversations. How do we move out of a model of 5 people, often largely looking like me, making all of the decisions about where grants funding is flowing? How do we move that into more community allocation in decentralized ways, and maybe separate these functions of curation of projects and where the actual capital allocation amounts end up? And how do we just bring more network effects and solidarity and think more about movement logic rather than just organizational logic? So that's the call to action as well. We would love to welcome a lot of these new projects who are new to Web3. We've been doing Zoom information calls and trying to help people set up their wallet and write their 12 words down and talk about cybersecurity and explain bridging and going through the UX. And it's definitely a challenge from a user experience side, of course, as we all know. But yeah, just big shout out to what Gitcoin's enabled, because a guy on a farm in New Zealand could permissionlessly put ETH up into a smart contract and really start distributing and playing around with these tools and onboarding new people. And so during GG20, look out for us at Ma Earth. Even just $5, $10 contribution here and there, I think will really help signal to a lot of these land projects that there's a there, and just trying to kind of weave these communities together more. So it's maearth.com/grants. Thank you so much for having me.
I have a question about how the matching works, because it seemed from some read of it that it was like about the number of people who signed up, and maybe like barbell that many people signed up or something. Yeah, so can you kind of explain the mechanics there so that people understand it's not about just being kind of like baited into participation in crypto for the sake of crypto, but it really is focused on the projects? Like, can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I'm not the best person to speak to it, but Quadratic's funding, Vitalik Buterin is one of the co-authors on the paper. Gitcoin has really brought this into the consciousness and implementation phase. And essentially the allocation from the matching pool is a blended formula that looks not only at the dollars donated, but also at the number of people who donated. So if you have 2 projects and they both raised $100, and one of them raised it from 1 donor, and one of them raised it from 50 donors, right? That one of 50 donors is a signal that has broader community support. So a traditional philanthropic matching kind of pool project crowdfunding campaign would match dollars only blindly. And what this is doing is it's really looking at community support and kind of number of donors. And I think it's important because it is, to me, it's partly rooted in a recognition that we live in a society where 1% of people control 90% of assets, right? So we need to kind of build these new financial mechanisms, starting from those conditions and kind of helping us course correct. But also it kind of creates a flywheel effect, because the value proposition to a donor is like, hey, look, if you help us out and you support our project, your $1 may be unlocking $3, $4, $5. And when I work with nonprofits and they're doing fundraising, and we're always in discussion about the most effective ways to fund this, that psychology, I think, should not be underestimated. So it kind of creates the flywheel where now I go to my mailing list and I go reach out to my community and social media to try to bring community kind of crowdfunding in. Of course it has problems, it can become a popularity contest, there's Sybil attacks, there's all the different things that we are continuing to iterate, and Gitcoin's continuing to iterate on, and many others. But that's kind of the gist.